viewers, and welcome back to Dukascopy TV. I'm Natalie MacDonald. Up next in the studio, I'm joined by FATCA expert Alexandre Favre of Newtone Associates. Alexandre, thank you very much for coming in today.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, now talking FATCA, we've had Jersey, Guernsey and the Isle of Man, who are just some of the latest countries to sign up to FATCA, and also news that Russia will also soon be joining. Talk us through some of the changes that we've seen since you last spoke to us in October.
Okay, so I think there's three important things to understand with these different agreements that countries are passing or signing with the US and the IRS. There's three different ways you can actually sign up for FATCA. The first one is IGA1, it's called the Intergovernmental Agreement, number one. Then you have the IGA2, Intergovernmental Agreement number 2, and then you have the FFI agreements that different banks can actually sign directly with the IRS. The main difference between these three types of contracts or agreements that you can sign with the IRS is that number one, they're basically countries that don't have banking secrecy. So a good example would be France, for example. So in this IGA1 model, you have France, the authorities that are signing directly with the IRS, and the banks will have to comply because they are under that legislation, underneath the authorities of the signing country, so France, for example. And the banks will have to provide the local tax authorities, the French tax authorities, with US citizens that are not complying with FATCA, and then the government will send those names to the US. So you're not going against any banking secrecy, because all the local legislation is respected. In the IG2 model, which is the one from Switzerland, and I think today Japan signed also in this model, you have banking secrecy. And this is a different, obviously different concept because the banks just can't send over names, even recalcitrant names, so that's US taxpayers that are actually evading taxes. And in this model, the government signs with the IRS. The banks will send a certain number, just saying, okay, we have 10, 15, how many clients that are recalcitrant without giving any names. And then if the US decides to go one step further, they'll have to do a specific request to the Swiss government or to the Japanese government or to any government that signs this IGA2. And through this request, the banks will send the names to the government and the government will send it back to the US. So it's a bit different. Number two is, there's this legislation to respect the banking secrecy, but at the end of the day, the IRS gets what it wants. And then you have the number three, which is just the FFI agreement, where basically it's countries that don't want to sign up directly, or certain countries that don't have total control over what's happening in the financial industry in their country. And then the banks will have to sign up directly with the IRS. So it's not 100% sure yet, but certain countries, we think, for example, Saudi Arabia is going to opt for this type of agreement. And so all of this is happening now. So this is really the big change since last time, is that countries are signing up, things are really moving forward and getting ready for the full FATCA go live, hopefully in June 2014.
If we use Russia then as sort of a case study, Russia not joining FATCA would have seen Russia's banks directly signing up for the legislation and then in turn breaching the country's privacy and data protection laws. Is this just an example of how divisive FATCA has become slightly between governments and their domestic banking institutes?
Yeah, that's entirely right. Basically, when the IRS came up with FATCA, they said, oh, this is fantastic, we're going to catch all our taxpayers around the world, this is great. But I think they didn't really think it through until the end, because implementation is a completely different story. And the US, yes, the US is a very strong, as we all know, one of the strongest economy in the world, but they still don't control all the legislation in all the countries. So if you take Russia, for example, this is the whole concept between banks and authorities is banks will have to sign up with FATCA. International banks, groups, UBS, HSBC, Credit Suisse, Citicorp, whatever type of huge banking corporation that has activities all around the world will have to sign up, because what's happening with the IRS and how the IRS is implementing is saying, okay, either you participate, and if you don't participate, participating banks will have the obligation to withhold funds on you. So that's why banks have to participate. But now if you are, if you have your subsidiary or your head office as an international bank in Russia, and Russia does not sign that legislation, and they have banking secrecy rules, then you're in a very difficult place, in a difficult situation. That means that officially you have to do it, but you can't sign because you're going against local laws. So it's kind of tricky. And at the end of the day, I think big countries, countries that are really, big economies around the world, ultimately will have to sign. It's just the way it has to be done. Unfortunately, the U.S. still have power, economic power to do this, to put that stick on us. So that's the way it works. But, there's some countries that ultimately will also decide not to sign. We've been hearing that, for example, Saudi Arabia might not sign too. And it's going to be difficult because if you're an international bank and you have your subsidiary in Saudi Arabia, what's going to happen? How are you going to comply? So these are questions that all the lawyers and all your tax advisors, your tax experts will have to go through in the next couple of months.
We've touched already upon banking secrecy and on privacy. How are foreign banking institutes likely to respond to a recent report by the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, which claims that the IRS, in fact, are pretty unprepared really for FATCA and could end up compromising the information of not only Americans themselves, but also the foreign institutes that have signed up for this? Is this, in your view, an actual cause for concern, or perhaps a tool to try and push back that FATCA implementation in, as you've said, June hopefully of next year?
Well, I think that it is a concern. I wouldn't say it's not really a legal or legislative concern in the sense, they push it back 6 months, doesn't matter, okay, who cares, we'll just comply in 6 months. But I would say it's more of a project concern, is that all these banks, and these huge banks, these groups, that are working, that have activities in Monaco, in Switzerland, in the US, in Canada, wherever around the world, trying to centralize these projects is very difficult and very time consuming, and you're spending lots of big budgets also doing this, hiring consultants, hiring different people to review your accounts, changing your procedures, training the people, and every time you push it back, the problem is that, you push the whole team back too, and you have to keep these people there, and you have to pay them again another extra 6 months. So I think this is something obviously the IRS didn't think of and did not anticipate, and banks just have to kind of comply and keep on doing it, which, we know banks, we know financial institutions are companies that have the means to do it, but at the end of the day, they're going to suffer out of it too, if they have to keep on pushing back and paying. So it is a concern. It's just, I would say, good project management and a good way to organize things, and that's the way to mitigate this risk and mitigate the problems of having these deadlines pushed back.
So if we look, in fact, a little bit closer to home, we'll bring this topic to Switzerland. At the end of November, the Swiss authorities did in fact confirm that they would comply with FATCA. Yeah. How has the Swiss government administration sought to meet this criteria of FATCA then?
Okay, so I would say the most important thing is that we have to, as we say in French, appeler un chat un chat, which means that FATCA was created for countries to go against countries or try to control countries like in banking terms of banking secrecy, like Switzerland. So from the beginning, since FATCA came about I think 5 years ago in 2008, Switzerland has been preparing much more than any other country, any big financial, I would say, market in the world. So the first thing is to get the legislation, passed through local laws. So you had the laws, the FATCA laws that were approved by the National Council, and so that's the Parliament, plus the Ministers' Parliament called the Conseil des États. So both chambers or both organs of the Swiss government accepted this law. So that's the first thing they have done. Then the second thing was to get the agreement also agreed between Switzerland and the US, so that's they done. And through the FINMA, which is the banking supreme authority in Switzerland, they also signed or ratified the agreement, the IGA2 agreement between Switzerland and US with the FINMA too. So, and the FINMA basically says that if you're a bank in Switzerland, if you're a local bank, if you're an international bank, or whatever type of bank institution active in the financial industry you'll have to comply to FATCA. So these are all the steps that the Swiss government really pushed and decided to implement to make sure that Switzerland will be fully compliant. So this again, I think it's important to understand that as an international bank in Switzerland, I think all the rules are very clear. You have to comply, you have to do this and that, but then you have these international banks. I'll take an example, UBS. Yes, it's a very big and large international group, but if UBS has their main office here, and that main office, is giving banking services, has banking subsidiaries around the world, then how do they comply then? I mean, who has to report to the IRS? Does that subsidiary have to give the information to the Swiss head office of the bank, and then that information goes to the IRS, or how is this all going to be organized? So these are complex questions that are still unresolved, and actually the Swiss authorities won't be able to answer.
I think that's a topic we're going to continue coming back to. Great for you.
That's good.
Thank you so much for coming in and sharing your expertise with us. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
For more interviews on financial hot topics such as this one, stay tuned to Dukascopy TV. Goodbye for now.